What happens when freedom comes with a bounty on your head? When 20 armed men hunt one soul, but find an entire clan ready to die for what's right? Subscribe now for more incredible historical stories that will leave you speechless. The Mississippi heat hung thick as molasses over the Powell homestead, where freedom wore a different face than what the newspapers up north liked to paint. It was 1867, 2 years since the Emancipation Proclamation had supposedly set every soul free, but down here in Wilkinson County, liberty still came with a price tag and a wanted poster. Ezra Powell wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he worked the small plot of land he'd managed to claim after the war. At 53, his back bore the scars of 30 years under the lash, but his eyes held something that hadn't been there during slavery. Hope mixed with a dangerous determination. Around him, his extended family, blood relatives and chosen kin alike, had built something resembling a community. 7 families, 42 souls in total, all trying to carve out an existence in a world that seemed determined to drag them back into bondage. The homestead itself was a testament to their resilience. What had started as a collection of crude lean-tos had grown into a proper settlement. The main cabin, where Ezra and Sarah lived, was built from cypress logs they'd cut themselves from the nearby swamp. Its thick walls had been chinked with mud and moss, creating a fortress-like structure that could withstand both the elements and more human threats. The other buildings, Joshua's cabin, Samuel's workshop, the communal kitchen, and the small schoolhouse where the children learned their letters, were arranged in a rough circle around the central yard, creating natural defensive positions. The land they'd claimed wasn't much, 40 acres of Mississippi bottomland that the previous owner had abandoned during the war. But it was theirs, purchased with back wages from their service as union laborers and defended with blood when necessary. They'd planted cotton, corn and vegetables, raised chickens and pigs, and slowly built something that resembled prosperity. More importantly, they'd built something that resembled dignity. "Papa Ezra," called out his youngest son, Marcus, running up from the main road with dust kicking up behind his bare feet. "There's a man coming. Looks hurt bad." Ezra straightened, his hand instinctively moving to the old cavalry saber he kept at his side. A trophy from a dead Confederate officer who'd learned too late that some slaves fought back. The weapon had saved his life more than once during the war, when he'd served as a scout for Union forces moving through Mississippi. In these parts, strangers usually meant trouble, and trouble usually wore a badge or carried a rope. The man who stumbled into their clearing was barely more than a boy, maybe 19, with skin dark as midnight and eyes wide with the particular terror that came from being hunted. His clothes were torn, his feet bloody, and he clutched a piece of paper in his trembling hand like it was his last hope on earth. Dried blood caked his shirt where thorns had torn through the fabric, and his breathing came in ragged gasps that spoke of days without proper rest. "Please," he gasped, falling to his knees in the red dirt. They said the Powell Clan would help, said you don't turn nobody away." Ezra's wife, Sarah, emerged from their cabin, her maternal instincts overriding caution. At 48, she was still a handsome woman, her hair now streaked with silver but her back straight and her eyes sharp. She'd birthed 8 children and buried 3, and she recognized the look of a child in mortal danger. The sight of this young man, barely older than her own sons, triggered every protective instinct she possessed. "Get him some water, Marcus, and fetch clean rags," she commanded, already moving toward the injured boy. "What's your name, son?" Ezra asked, kneeling beside the young man while his eyes scanned the tree line for signs of pursuit. Thomas Washington. I ran from the Hartwell plantation 3 days ago. They got dogs after me, and men with guns. 20 of them, maybe more." Ezra felt his blood chill. The Hartwell plantation was notorious even by Mississippi standards. Old man Hartwell had died during the war, but his son James had returned from Virginia with ideas about how to keep his property in line despite what the law now said. Sharecropping contracts that were slavery in all but name, debt that could never be repaid, and when that failed, bounty hunters who didn't much care about the difference between a runaway slave and a free man. The younger Hartwell had learned his cruelty from his father, but he'd refined it with a cold intelligence that made him even more dangerous. He understood that the old ways of controlling black labor were gone forever, so he'd adapted. His sharecropping contracts were masterpieces of legal theft. Workers could never earn enough to pay off their debts, and any attempt to leave was treated as theft of services. Those who tried to escape found themselves hunted by professional bounty hunters who operated with the full blessing of local law enforcement. 20 men for one boy? Sarah asked, her voice tight with anger as she began cleaning Thomas's wounds. What did you do to them? Thomas looked up, his young face etched with pain and something deeper, the kind of soul-deep exhaustion that came from living in constant fear. I learned to read, Ma'am. Taught myself from a Bible I found in the old master's house after he died. When Master James found out, he said I was getting too uppity, said he was going to sell me down to Louisiana, to the sugar fields. His voice broke. I got a girl, ma'am. We was going to get married proper, soon as I saved enough to buy her freedom. I couldn't let them take me away from her. The paper in his hand was a crude map, drawn by someone who'd risked their life to help him. It showed the route to the Powell homestead, marked with an X and the words "Free Ground" written in shaky letters. The map had been drawn by old Moses, a preacher who moved between plantations, conducting secret weddings and baptisms. Moses had been spreading word about the Powell clan for months, telling anyone who would listen that there was a place where black folks stood up for each other. Ezra studied the map, recognizing Moses's careful hand. The old preacher had been a friend during the war, helping Union scouts navigate the treacherous backwaters of Mississippi. If Moses had sent this boy to them, it meant the situation was desperate indeed. Sarah, Ezra said quietly, get the boy fed and cleaned up. Joshua, Samuel, we need to talk. As the women tended to Thomas, the men of the Powell clan gathered in the shade of the old oak tree that had become their unofficial meeting place. The tree was ancient, its massive trunk scarred by lightning and time, its branches spreading wide enough to shelter half the homestead. It was here they'd planned their escape from slavery. Here they'd decided to stay and fight for their land. When the clan came calling, here they'd made every decision that had kept their family alive and free. Joshua Powell, Ezra's eldest son at 28, was built like his father, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that could gentle a horse or break a man's neck with equal ease. He'd served in the Union Army during the final year of the war, one of the few black men in his regiment to survive the brutal fighting in Virginia. The experience had taught him that freedom was something you fought for, not something you were given. Samuel Powell, Ezra's younger brother, was a giant of a man, standing 6.5 feet tall with arms like tree trunks. He'd been the plantation blacksmith before the war, and his skills with metal had made him invaluable to the Union cause. Now he used those same skills to keep the homestead's tools sharp and their weapons in working order. His workshop was filled with improvised weapons, sharpened farm tools, reinforced clubs, and the occasional firearm that had fallen off a supply wagon. David Powell, Joshua's younger brother at 16, was the best shot in the family despite his youth. He'd learned to hunt in the swamps around the plantation, developing an almost supernatural ability to move silently through the wilderness and hit targets at impossible ranges. His rifle, a captured Confederate Whitworth, was his most prized possession. 20 bounty hunters, Samuel said, his voice like gravel. That's more than came after us when we first settled here. It ain't about the boy, Joshua added, understanding the larger picture. It's about us, about what we represent. They let one plantation slave find sanctuary here, others gonna follow. Pretty soon every slave in Mississippi gonna know there's a place they can run to. Ezra nodded grimly. The Powell homestead had become something more than just a family farm. It had become a symbol. Word had spread through the underground network of black churches, traveling preachers and secret gatherings that there was a place where former slaves had not only claimed their freedom, but were willing to defend it with their lives. That made them dangerous in ways that went far beyond their actual military capabilities. And that scares them more than anything, Ezra continued. A place where black folks stand up for each other, where we don't bow down or step aside. That's their worst nightmare. David, young but wise beyond his years, spoke up. So what do we do, Uncle Ezra? Turn him away? Let them take him back to that hell? The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. They all knew the practical answer. One boy wasn't worth risking 42 lives, but they also knew that some things mattered more than practicality. The Powell clan had built their reputation on the principle that they didn't abandon their own, and Thomas Washington had become one of their own the moment he'd stepped foot on their land. "My daddy died in chains," Ezra said finally, his voice heavy with old pain. "Worked himself to death in them cotton fields, never knowing what it felt like to be free. Never saw his grandchildren grow up as free people. I swore on his grave that no child of mine, no person under my protection, would ever go back to that. Not while I draw breath." Samuel cracked his knuckles, a sound like breaking wood. "Then we best get ready for a fight." The decision made, they began their preparations with the methodical efficiency of men who'd faced death before. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, ammunition was distributed, and defensive positions were reinforced. The children were gathered and given their instructions. At the first sign of trouble, they were to hide in the root cellar and not come out until the all-clear was given. As the sun began to set over the Mississippi countryside, painting the sky the color of blood, the Powell clan made their final preparations. They'd faced down the Klan, survived carpetbaggers and night riders, carved out their freedom from a hostile world. But they'd never faced anything like what was coming. 20 armed men, professional hunters who made their living tracking down human beings. Men who saw Thomas not as a person seeking freedom, but as property to be returned to its rightful owner. Men who would kill anyone who stood in their way. But the Powells had something those hunters didn't understand. They had something worth dying for. And sometimes that made all the difference. Dawn broke gray and ominous over Wilkinson County, the kind of morning that felt heavy with unspoken threats. The air itself seemed to press down on the Powell homestead like a physical weight, thick with humidity and the promise of violence. Thomas had spent the night in the Powell family's root cellar, hidden beneath sacks of sweet potatoes and dried corn, but sleep had been impossible. Every sound, every cricket, every owl, every creak of settling wood might herald the arrival of his pursuers. The root cellar was a marvel of engineering, dug deep into the red Mississippi clay and reinforced with cypress timbers. It served multiple purposes: food storage, storm shelter, and hiding place for those times when the outside world became too dangerous. The walls were lined with shelves holding preserved vegetables, smoked meat, and other supplies that could sustain the family through a siege. A narrow tunnel known only to the Powell clan connected the cellar to the swamp behind the homestead, providing an escape route if the worst should happen. Ezra hadn't slept either. He'd spent the dark hours checking and rechecking their defenses, such as they were. The Powell homestead wasn't built for war, but necessity had taught them to be creative. Windows had been reinforced with thick wooden shutters, each one pierced with gun ports that could accommodate rifle barrels. The spaces between buildings had been strung with wire at ankle height, invisible in the dark, potentially deadly to men moving fast. Most importantly, they dug a series of trenches connecting the main buildings, allowing movement without exposure. The defensive preparations were the result of hard-learned lessons the clan had visited twice in the past 2 years, and each time the Powell clan had been forced to adapt their tactics. The first raid had caught them unprepared, and only luck and determination had saved them. The second time they'd been ready, and 3 night riders had learned that terrorizing the Powell family was a dangerous occupation. Word had spread after that, and the clan had found easier targets elsewhere. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The first sign of trouble came from young Marcus, who'd been posted as a lookout in the old oak tree. His whistle, 3 short, sharp notes, sent everyone scrambling to their positions. From his perch 30 feet above the ground, he could see the dust cloud long before the riders became visible, a brown smudge against the morning sky that spoke of many horses moving fast. Marcus had been trained for this moment since he was old enough to climb. His position in the oak tree gave him a commanding view of all approaches to the homestead, and his sharp young eyes could spot trouble long before it reached them. He carried a small brass telescope that had belonged to a Union officer, and through it he could make out details that would be invisible to the naked eye. "How many?" Ezra called up softly, his voice barely carrying above the morning breeze. "Can't tell yet, Papa, but it's a lot. More than 20 horses, I think. And they got dogs with them," The mention of dogs sent a chill through everyone who heard it. Dogs meant this wasn't just about capturing Thomas, it was about sending a message to every black family in the county. Dogs were used for hunting runaway slaves, but they were also used for intimidation, for creating the kind of terror that kept people in line. Sarah emerged from the main cabin, her face set in grim determination. She carried an old shotgun that had belonged to her father, a free man from New Orleans who'd taught her that freedom was something you fought for, not something you were given. The weapon was ancient but well maintained, its double barrels capable of devastating effect at close range. She'd used it before, during the Clan raids, and she was prepared to use it again. "Thomas is secure," she reported, "and the children are in the safe room." The safe room was another necessity of their new life, a hidden space beneath the floorboards of the main cabin where the youngest members of the family could hide during trouble. It had been used during Clan raids, when night riders came looking for uppity blacks to terrorize. The space was cramped and airless, but it had saved lives more than once. Today it might be the difference between life and death for the next generation of Powells. Joshua took his position at the front window of his cabin, his rifle, a Spencer repeater he'd taken from a dead Union soldier, loaded and ready. The Spencer was a marvel of modern warfare. Capable of firing 7 rounds without reloading, Joshua had become expert with the weapon during his service in Virginia, and he taught the other men in the family how to use it effectively. Rebecca, his wife, crouched beside him with their baby daughter pressed against her chest, her own pistol in her free hand. They'd agreed that if the worst happened, she would take their child and run for the swamp, where the hunters' horses couldn't follow. Rebecca was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she possessed a fierce determination that matched any of the Powell men. She'd been born free in New Orleans, the daughter of a successful carpenter, and she'd never known the particular fear that came with slavery. But she'd learned quickly after marrying Joshua that freedom was something that had to be defended every day. Samuel positioned himself in the workshop, where his massive frame could make the most of the heavy tools that doubled as weapons. The workshop was his domain, filled with the tools of his trade and the improvised weapons he'd crafted for the family's defense. Sledgehammers, sharpened chisels, reinforced clubs, all arranged within easy reach. His position commanded the right flank of the homestead, and his strength made him a formidable opponent in close combat. David, despite his youth, had proven himself a crack shot during previous troubles, and he took the most exposed position, the barn loft, where he could cover the main approach but would be vulnerable if the hunters circled around. His Whitworth rifle was a precision instrument, capable of hitting targets at ranges that would challenge even experienced marksmen. He'd modified the barn loft specifically for defensive purposes, creating firing positions that offered both concealment and clear fields of fire. The riders came into view just as the sun cleared the tree line, and Marcus's sharp intake of breath told the story before his words did. 23 men, Papa, all armed, and they got dogs. Through his telescope, Marcus could see the hunting party in detail. They rode in a loose formation, professional and disciplined in their movements. The dogs, lean and vicious-looking hounds, strained at their leashes, their handlers struggling to keep them under control. These weren't farm dogs or hunting hounds. These were animals bred and trained specifically for tracking human beings. Ezra felt his heart sink. Dogs meant they could track Thomas even if he tried to run. Dogs meant this wasn't just about capturing one runaway. It was about sending a message to every black family in the county. The message was simple. We can find you anywhere, and we will never stop hunting you. The hunting party was led by a man Ezra recognized, Captain William Morse, a former Confederate officer who'd made bounty hunting his profession after the war. Morse was known for his cruelty and his efficiency in equal measure. He'd never failed to bring back his quarry, dead or alive, and he took particular pleasure in hunting down troublesome blacks who'd gotten ideas above their station. Morse was a tall, lean man with the bearing of a professional soldier. His grey uniform was immaculate despite the long ride, and his weapons were clean and well maintained. He'd served under Nathan Bedford Forrest during the war, learning the art of irregular warfare and the value of psychological intimidation. After the surrender, he'd found that his skills translated well to the business of hunting human beings. Beside Morse rode James Hartwell himself, the plantation owner whose property had dared to seek freedom. Hartwell was younger than Ezra had expected, maybe 35, with the soft features of a man who'd never done a day's hard labor in his life. But his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who viewed human beings as livestock, and his presence here meant that this was personal for him. Hartwell had inherited his plantation from his father, along with the older man's attitudes about the proper place of black people in society. The war had disrupted his world, but he was determined to restore the old order by any means necessary. He'd invested heavily in the bounty hunting business, seeing it as a way to maintain control over his labor force, even after emancipation. The rest of the hunting party was a mix of professional bounty hunters and local men looking to make a quick dollar. Some Ezra recognized, poor whites who'd been convinced that their problems came from uppity blacks rather than the rich men who kept them in poverty. Others were strangers, hard-faced men who'd drifted south after the war, drawn by the easy money to be made hunting human beings. Among them were the Garrett brothers, notorious for their cruelty even by bounty hunter standards. They'd been cashiered from the Confederate Army for excessive brutality, which was saying something. There was also Preacher Williams, a defrocked minister who'd found that hunting runaway slaves paid better than saving souls, and bringing up the rear was a group of local toughs, men who'd never amounted to much, but had found purpose in terrorizing their former slaves. The party stopped just outside rifle range, close enough to be heard, but far enough away to avoid immediate danger. Captain Morse nudged his horse forward a few steps and called out in a voice that carried clearly across the morning air. "Ezra Powell, I know you can hear me. We're here for the boy Thomas Washington, property of Mr. James Hartwell. Send him out and we'll be on our way. No harm needs to come to your family." The words were reasonable, almost polite, but everyone who heard them understood the threat beneath the surface. Morse was offering them one chance to surrender before the violence began. It was more courtesy than most bounty hunters bothered with. Ezra stepped out onto his porch, his cavalry saber at his side and his old musket in his hands. He cut an imposing figure despite his age, tall, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of a man who'd faced death before and wasn't impressed by it. His presence seemed to fill the space around him, and even the dogs fell silent as he appeared. "Thomas Washington is a free man," Ezra called back, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Emancipation Proclamation made that clear. You got no legal right to him." Morse laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Legal right? Boy, you're in Mississippi, not Massachusetts. Down here we got our own ideas about what's legal. That boy's got a debt to pay, and Mr. Hartwell's got a contract says he belongs on that plantation until it's settled." The contract system was the new face of slavery, dressed up in legal language but serving the same purpose. Workers were advanced supplies and housing against future wages, but the prices were set so high that they could never earn enough to pay off their debts. Any attempt to leave was treated as theft, and the local courts were happy to enforce the contracts with the full weight of the law. "Debt slavery," Joshua muttered from his position. "Same as the old days, just with different paperwork." Hartwell himself spoke up, his voice carrying the lazy arrogance of inherited wealth. "That boy stole from me, stole the time and labor I was owed. He's going to work off what he owes, one way or another, and anyone who harbors a thief is just as guilty as the thief himself." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. In the post-war South, the charge of theft could be applied to almost any action by a black person that white people didn't like. Learning to read was theft of time that should have been spent working. Leaving a job was theft of future labor. Even defending oneself could be construed as theft of a white person's right to dominance. "The only thieves I see," Ezra replied, his voice carrying clearly across the distance, "are the ones trying to steal a man's freedom." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Several of the hunters shifted restlessly in their saddles, hands moving to their weapons. The dogs, lean and vicious-looking hounds, strained at their leashes, sensing the tension. Their handlers, experienced men who knew the value of psychological warfare, let the animals growl and snap, adding to the atmosphere of menace. Morse's face hardened. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Powell. We know the boy's here. We can smell him on the wind. Send him out, or we'll come in and get him. and if we have to come in, some of your people might get hurt in the confusion." The threat was clear and unmistakable. Morse was offering them one last chance to avoid bloodshed, but his tone made it clear that he was hoping they would refuse. Men like Morse didn't make their reputations by negotiating. They made them by demonstrating what happened to those who defied them. "The only confusion here," Ezra said, raising his musket slightly, "is why you think 23 men with guns makes you brave. You want Thomas Washington? You're going to have to come through us to get him." Samuel's voice boomed from the workshop, loud enough for the hunters to hear. "And we've been waiting for you." The threat was clear, and both sides knew it. This wasn't going to end with negotiation or compromise. This was going to end with blood. Morse turned to consult with Hartwell and his lieutenants, their voices too low to carry, but their gestures making their intentions clear. They were planning their attack, deciding how to take the homestead with minimal risk to themselves. The professional hunters among them were studying the defensive positions, looking for weaknesses they could exploit. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They thought they were dealing with former slaves who would break and run at the first sign of real violence. They didn't understand that the Powell clan had already faced the worst the world could throw at them, and had chosen to stand their ground. As the hunters made their plans, Ezra called softly to his family. "Remember what we talked about. They want to take us alive if they can. We're worth more as examples than as corpses. But they'll kill us if they have to. Don't give them the choice." The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the dew and promising another scorching Mississippi day. But for the Powell clan, the heat they felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was the heat of righteous anger, of people pushed too far, of a family that had decided some things were worth dying for. The hunters were about to learn that lesson the hard way. The attack came at noon, when the sun was highest and shadows were shortest, offering the least concealment for defenders. Captain Morse had chosen his moment well, or so he thought. The blazing Mississippi sun would be in the defenders' eyes, and the heat would sap their strength and concentration. It was a tactical decision born of military experience and refined by years of hunting human beings. The first wave consisted of 6 men on horseback, charging straight up the main path toward the Powell homestead, while firing their pistols wildly. It was meant to be a distraction, drawing attention and fire while the main force circled around to attack from the flanks. Classic military tactics, the kind Morse had learned during his service under Forrest. The riders whooped and hollered as they came, their voices mixing with the thunder of hooves and the crack of gunfire. But Ezra Powell had learned a few things during the war too. The charging riders ran straight into the wire strung between the fence posts, invisible until it was too late. The wire had been positioned at exactly the right height to catch horses at full gallop, and the results were devastating. 2 horses went down immediately, their legs tangled in the steel strands, their riders thrown hard against the packed earth. The sound of breaking bones, both human and equine, filled the air as man and beast crashed together in a tangle of limbs and screaming. A 3rd horse stumbled, its rider fighting to stay in the saddle as the animal fought to regain its footing. The momentary confusion gave David a clear shot from the barn loft. His Whitworth rifle cracked like thunder, and one of the bounty hunters pitched backward from his saddle, clutching his shoulder as blood poured between his fingers. "First blood to us," Samuel called out grimly from his position in the workshop. But Morse was already adapting, his military training taking over as he assessed the situation. The frontal assault had failed, but it had served its purpose. He now knew the locations of the defenders' positions and the nature of their defenses. While the frontal assault faltered, his main force split into 2 groups, one heading for each flank of the homestead. These weren't the wild charges of desperate men. These were coordinated movements by professionals who knew their business. The group attacking from the left, led by the notorious Garrett brothers, consisted of 8 men who dismounted and were advancing on foot. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before, using the outbuildings and natural cover to mask their approach. Their leader, Jake Garrett, was a scarred veteran of a dozen campaigns, his face marked by a saber cut that had nearly cost him his left eye. This group ran into Joshua's position first. The young veteran had positioned himself perfectly, with clear fields of fire and solid cover. His Spencer repeater spoke 7 times in rapid succession, the metallic clatter of the lever action mixing with the boom of gunfire. The sound was distinctive, and every man who'd served in the war knew what it meant. They were facing someone who knew how to use his weapon. 2 hunters fell in the first volley, their bodies crumpling to the red Mississippi earth. A third man screamed as Joshua's bullet shattered his thigh, sending him sprawling behind a water trough. But the others pressed forward, using the outbuildings for cover as they advanced. They were professionals, and they understood that the only way to survive a firefight was to close the distance and overwhelm the defenders. "They're getting close," Rebecca called out, her own pistol adding to the defensive fire. Her shots were carefully aimed, each one intended to force the attackers to keep their heads down rather than to kill. She was a good shot, but she was also a mother, and her primary concern was protecting her child rather than taking lives. On the right flank, Samuel found himself facing 5 men who'd dismounted and were advancing on foot, using the workshop's blind spots to get within striking distance. These men were led by Preacher Williams, a man whose religious training had given him an intimate knowledge of human nature and its weaknesses. He understood that the key to breaking a defense was to isolate the defenders and attack them one at a time. Samuel's position was strong, built around the heavy tools and equipment of his trade, but he was outnumbered, and the attackers were spreading out to surround him. The workshop's thick walls provided excellent protection from rifle fire, but they also limited his ability to see what was happening around him. He could hear the men moving outside, their boots scraping against the hard-packed earth, but he couldn't pinpoint their exact locations. That's when the Powell Clan's greatest advantage revealed itself. They weren't fighting as individuals, but as a family. David, from his elevated position in the barn loft, could see the entire battlefield spread out below him like a deadly chess game. His rifle swung toward the men threatening Samuel, and his first shot took down the hunter trying to circle behind the workshop. The man had been creeping along the back wall, thinking himself invisible, when David's bullet found him. He dropped like a stone, his rifle clattering away across the packed earth. David's second shot shattered the shoulder of another attacker, sending the man spinning to the ground with a scream of pain and rage. The wounded hunter tried to crawl to safety, leaving a trail of blood in the red dirt, but he was out of the fight. But the movement exposed David's position, and return fire from the hunters began chewing up the wooden walls around him. Splinters flew like deadly rain, and he was forced to duck below the loft's edge as bullets whined overhead. The barn's old wood offered little protection against rifle fire, and David could feel the structure shaking with each impact. "David's pinned down!" Marcus called from his lookout post in the oak tree, his young voice tight with fear for his brother. The boy had been watching the battle unfold with the fascination and terror that only the young could feel. From his elevated position, he could see everything: the fallen hunters, the blood soaking into the earth, the desperate movements of men fighting for their lives. It was his first real taste of violence, and it would mark him for the rest of his life. Ezra made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who didn't understand what they were fighting for. He stepped out of his defensive position and into the open, his old musket in one hand and his cavalry saber in the other. The weapon had served him well during the war, and its weight in his hand was comforting and familiar. "You want to fight?" he roared, his voice carrying across the battlefield like a challenge from the gods themselves. "Then fight me!" It was exactly the kind of heroic gesture that should have gotten him killed immediately. Standing in the open, exposed to fire from multiple directions, he presented a perfect target for any of the hunters who could draw a bead on him. But Ezra Powell had spent 53 years learning how to read men, and he'd seen something in the hunters' eyes that gave him hope. They were starting to doubt. These men had signed up to capture one runaway slave, not to assault a fortified position defended by people who fought like demons. They'd expected the Powell clan to break and run at the first sign of serious resistance, the way most former slaves did when confronted with overwhelming force. Instead, they were facing coordinated defensive fire from people who clearly knew what they were doing. The sight of Ezra Powell standing defiantly in the open, challenging them to single combat, was more than many of the hunters had bargained for. This wasn't the cowering, submissive behavior they expected from former slaves. This was the behavior of free men defending their home, and it shook them more than they cared to admit. Morse himself was beginning to realize he'd made a serious miscalculation. His force had already taken casualties, 4 men down, 2 more wounded, and they hadn't even reached the main buildings yet. At this rate, he'd lose half his men before they could secure the objective. The professional in him recognized that this operation was going badly wrong, but his pride and his reputation demanded that he see it through. But James Hartwell wasn't interested in tactical considerations or casualty counts. He wanted his property back, and he wanted to make an example of anyone who dared to help a runaway slave. The sight of his men falling to defensive fire only enraged him further, and he began screaming orders that had more to do with vengeance than strategy. "Burn them out!" he screamed, his face red with rage and humiliation. "Burn the whole place down! I don't care if we take them alive or dead!" 2 of the hunters produced torches, crude affairs made from rags soaked in coal oil and tied to sticks. They'd come prepared for this possibility, understanding that sometimes the only way to root out defenders was to destroy their positions entirely. They lit the torches from a small fire they'd built behind their position and began advancing toward the nearest cabin, their faces grim with determination. The sight of the torches sent a chill through the Powell clan. Fire was their greatest fear, the one thing that could destroy everything they'd built and leave them with nothing. The cabins were built of wood and chinked with moss. They would burn like tinder once the flames took hold. That's when Sarah Powell made her own decision about what was worth fighting for. She emerged from the main cabin like an avenging angel, her father's shotgun in her hands and fury in her eyes. The first torchbearer never saw her coming. Her shotgun blast took him center mass, the double load of buckshot lifting him off his feet and sending him sprawling in the dirt. The torch flew from his dead hand, landing harmlessly in the packed earth where it sputtered and died. The second man spun toward her, raising his pistol with desperate speed, but Sarah was already moving. She broke open her shotgun and reloaded with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd been handling firearms since childhood. Her father had taught her that a gun was a tool, no different from a hammer or a plow, and she used it with the same calm competence. Her second shot took the torchbearer in the leg, shattering his femur and sending him sprawling. The torch flew from his hand, landing in the dirt where it sputtered and died. The man screamed and clutched his ruined leg, blood pouring between his fingers as he writhed in agony. But Sarah's heroics had exposed her to fire from the other hunters, and bullets began kicking up dirt around her feet. She dove for cover behind a water trough, but she was trapped in the open with nowhere to go. The trough was solid oak, thick enough to stop most bullets, but it wouldn't protect her if the hunters flanked her position. That's when Thomas Washington made his own choice about what kind of man he wanted to be. The young runaway emerged from his hiding place in the root cellar, despite every instinct screaming at him to stay hidden. He couldn't watch these people, these strangers who'd risked everything for him, die while he cowered in safety. The sight of Sarah Powell, a woman who'd shown him nothing but kindness, pinned down by gunfire because of him, was more than he could bear. "I'm here," he called out, stepping into the open with his hands raised. "I'm Thomas Washington. You want me? Here I am." For a moment, the gunfire slackened as both sides processed this unexpected development. Morse saw his objective standing in the open, apparently surrendering. Hartwell saw his property finally within reach. The other hunters saw an end to this bloody business that had already cost them more than they'd expected. But Ezra Powell saw something else entirely. A boy becoming a man, making the hardest choice of his life. "Get down, son," Ezra called out, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "This ain't your fight anymore." "Yes, it is," Thomas replied, his young voice steady despite his fear. "These people are dying for me. I won't let that happen." What happened next would be talked about in Wilkinson County for generations to come. Thomas didn't surrender. Instead, he picked up a rifle that had been dropped by one of the fallen hunters and took position beside Ezra Powell. The weapon was unfamiliar in his hands. He'd never been allowed to touch firearms on the plantation. But desperation and determination made up for lack of experience. His first shot, fired at a man who was drawing a bead on Sarah, was true. The bullet took the hunter in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. His second shot wounded another hunter who was trying to flank Joshua's position, the bullet shattering the man's arm and sending his rifle flying. The message was clear. Thomas Washington wasn't going back to slavery. not alive, and in that moment something shifted in the battle. The hunters, who'd been fighting for money, found themselves facing people who were fighting for something far more powerful. The right to be free, the right to protect their family, the right to stand up and say, "No more." Morse felt it too, the change in momentum, the way his men were starting to look toward the rear instead of pressing the attack. Professional soldiers knew when a battle was turning against them, and this one was going bad fast. The defenders were fighting with a desperation and coordination that his men couldn't match, and the casualties were mounting faster than he'd anticipated. But it was too late to retreat now. They'd committed themselves to this course of action, and the only way out was through. Morse knew that if he withdrew now, his reputation would be ruined. No one would hire a bounty hunter who'd been defeated by a handful of former slaves. The captain raised his pistol and took careful aim at Ezra Powell, the clear leader of the resistance. If he could take down the patriarch, the rest might still break and run. His finger tightened on the trigger as he lined up the shot, but he never got the chance to fire. David, from his position in the barn loft, had been waiting for exactly this moment. His rifle spoke once, and Captain William Morse, veteran of a dozen campaigns and hunter of men, fell from his saddle and didn't get up. The bullet had taken him in the head, killing him instantly and ending his reign of terror forever. The death of their leader should have broken the hunters' morale completely. Instead, it seemed to enrage them. Without Morse's tactical leadership, they abandoned all pretense of strategy and charged the homestead in a wild, desperate assault. It was the reaction of men who knew they were beaten but refused to accept defeat. It was exactly what the Powell clan had been waiting for. The final assault came like a thunderclap. 20 desperate men charging across open ground with nothing but fury and firearms to sustain them. They'd abandoned their horses, abandoned their tactics, abandoned everything except the primal need to finish what they'd started. The sight was both terrifying and pathetic. Grown men reduced to a howling mob, their professional discipline shattered by the unexpected resistance they'd encountered. It was the worst mistake they could have made. The Powell clan had spent the entire battle drawing the hunters in, making them commit to positions where the defenders' superior knowledge of the terrain would matter most. Every defensive position had been chosen with this moment in mind, every field of fire calculated to create an interlocking web of death that no one could cross alive. Now, with the enemy in the open and their leader dead, it was time to end this. Samuel Powell emerged from the workshop like a force of nature, his massive frame filling the doorway as he wielded a sledgehammer with devastating effect. The tool had been designed for shaping iron, but in Samuel's hands it became an instrument of terrible justice. The first hunter to reach him learned too late that some men were simply too big and too angry to stop. The hammer caught him in the chest with a sound like breaking wood, and he went down like a felled tree, his rib cage crushed beyond repair. The second hunter tried to bring his rifle to bear, but Samuel was already moving. Despite his size, the big man was surprisingly quick, and his years as a blacksmith had given him reflexes honed by working with red-hot metal. The sledgehammer swept around in a devastating arc, catching the hunter in the side of the head and ending his life instantly. Joshua's Spencer repeater spoke again and again, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. His position at the front window gave him a perfect field of fire across the main approach, and his military training had taught him to make every shot count. The rifle's 7-shot capacity meant he could maintain a steady rate of fire without the long pauses for reloading that plagued single-shot weapons. His wife Rebecca, their baby daughter safely hidden in the root cellar, had taken up a position at the side window and was adding her own fire to the defense. Her pistol was smaller than the men's rifles, but at close range it was just as deadly. Together, they created a killing field that no one could cross alive. Rebecca had never imagined she would be fighting for her life like this. Born free in New Orleans, she'd grown up in a world where violence was something that happened to other people. But marriage to Joshua had taught her that freedom was something that had to be defended every day. And she'd learned to shoot with the same determination that she'd learned to read and write. David, no longer pinned down in the barn loft, had climbed down to ground level where his rifle could do the most good. At 16, he was already a better shot than men twice his age, and he proved it by dropping 3 hunters in rapid succession. His Whitworth rifle was a precision instrument, and in his hands it became an extension of his will. The young man moved with a fluid grace that belied his youth, flowing from position to position as he sought the best angles of fire. His hunting experience in the swamps had taught him to move silently and strike without warning, skills that served him well in this deadlier game. But it was Ezra Powell himself who became the symbol of everything the hunters had underestimated about the people they'd come to terrorize. The old patriarch stood in the center of the homestead like an ancient oak tree, unmovable and unbreakable. His musket had long since been emptied, but his cavalry saber flashed in the afternoon sun as he met the hunter's charge head-on. This was a man who'd survived 30 years of slavery, who'd fought his way to freedom and carved out a life for his family in a hostile world. He wasn't about to be stopped by a bunch of bounty hunters. The saber had been taken from a Confederate officer during the war, a young lieutenant, who'd thought that